Hello and welcome back to the Brit Lit Book Club. I'm your host Vanessa and I'm absolutely delighted you've joined me for an exploration of what might be the most famous and influential short story ever written in the English language. Before we dive in, grab yourself a cup of tea if you can. I'm enjoying a spiced Christmas blend this morning, and there's something wonderfully appropriate about warming your hands around a festive cup while discussing the story that practically invented our modern Christmas. Last week we explored how Charles Dickens became the people's author, using his novels to expose social injustice and advocate for reform. Today, we're focusing on his most beloved and influential work, a little ghost story published in 1843 that changed not only how we celebrate Christmas, but how we think about wealth, poverty, and our obligations to one another. A Christmas Carol. You know the story, don't you? Let me give you a quick version if you need a refresher. Ebenezer Scrooge is a wealthy, miserly businessman who cares only about money. On Christmas Eve, he's visited first by the ghost of his dead business partner, Jacob Marley, who warns him that 3 spirits will visit him that night. The ghost of Christmas past shows Scrooge his lonely childhood and the moment he chose wealth over love. The ghost of Christmas present shows him how others celebrate Christmas, including his underpaid clerk, Bob Cratchit's family, and their sick son, Tiny Tim, who will die without proper care. Finally, the ghost of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge his own death, unmourned and unloved. His possessions stolen, Tiny Tim dead. Terrified, Scrooge wakes on Christmas morning transformed. He sends the Cratchits a huge turkey, raises Bob's salary, saves Tiny Tim's life, and becomes a generous, joyful man who learns to keep Christmas in his heart all year round. It's a simple story, almost a fairy tale. We've seen it adapted so many times, it's become part of our cultural DNA. Just last night, I watched the movie Spirited, which is basically a Christmas Carol. And the day before that, I watched a Hallmark movie called Christmas Above the Clouds, which is basically the same plotline. But here's what I want you to understand today. A Christmas Carol isn't just a heartwarming holiday tale. It's a radical political manifesto disguised as a ghost story. I wanted to talk about A Christmas Carol today because 2 of my kids are reading it for their English class right now, so it's been on my mind as they discuss what they've read recently, and it's given us a lot to talk about. When Dickens wrote his novella, England was in the midst of a heated debate about poverty, social responsibility, and the role of charity in an industrial capitalist society. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 had made life deliberately miserable for the poor in an attempt to discourage dependency. Many wealthy people believed that helping the poor only encouraged laziness and moral decay. Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol as a direct response to this cruel philosophy. He created Scrooge as the embodiment of his heartless capitalism, then used the structure of a ghost story to show exactly why this worldview was not just wrong, but morally monstrous and ultimately self-destructive. So let's step into Victorian London on a cold Christmas Eve and discover how Dickens packed an entire philosophy of social reform into 70-odd pages that continue to shape our values more than 180 years later. Let me start by telling you the circumstances that led Dickens to write A Christmas Carol, because understanding the context is crucial to understanding why the story had such explosive impact. But before we get to those circumstances, I want you to understand something personal about Dickens himself, because A Christmas Carol isn't just a response to social conditions. It's deeply rooted in his own childhood trauma. As we talked about last week, when Charles Dickens was 12 years old, his father was thrown into Marshalsea debtor's prison. The family was in crisis, and young Charles was sent to work at Warren's blacking factory, pasting labels on bottles of shoe polish for 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. He worked alongside other poor children in terrible conditions, and the humiliation and shame of it never left him. Dickens later wrote that he felt utterly abandoned, that his parents had given up on his education and his future. He was convinced that he would spend his entire life in the factory, that all his dreams and potential would be wasted. The experience lasted only a few months before a small inheritance allowed his father to leave prison and Charles to return to school. But those months shaped everything Dickens would write for the rest of his life. This is why poverty wasn't an abstract social problem for Dickens. It was viscerally personal. He knew what it felt like to be a child with no power, no prospects, no one to protect you. He knew the terror of falling through society's cracks, and he never forgot the other children in that factory who had no family to rescue them, who really would spend their entire lives in such places. So when Dickens wrote about poor children, he was writing about himself. When he attacked the smug assumption that poverty was the fault of the poor, he was defending that terrified 12-year-old boy. When he argued that society had an obligation to protect and educate the vulnerable children, he was imagining the help he wished someone would have given him. Keep this in mind as we look at how the story came together in the autumn of 1843. because that personal wound never healed. It just became fuel for one of the most powerful calls to social change ever written. In October 1843, just weeks before he began writing the story, Dickens visited the Field Lane Ragged School in one of London's worst slums. These schools provided basic education to children who were too poor, too dirty, or too wild for regular schools. What Dickens saw there horrified him. Children so malnourished and neglected they barely seemed human, living in conditions of almost unimaginable poverty. That same month, he read the report of the Children's Employment Commission about child labor in mines and factories. The testimonies were heartbreaking. Children as young as 5, working 14-hour days in dangerous conditions, denied education, denied childhood, denied any hope of a better future. Dickens wanted to write an angry political pamphlet about these conditions, but he realized that a pamphlet would only reach people who had already agreed with him. So instead, he wrote a story that would make people feel the truth about poverty and social responsibility in their hearts before they could construct intellectual defenses against it. The genius of A Christmas Carol is how Dickens structures the social message. He doesn't lecture or preach directly. Instead, he shows us the world through Scrooge's eyes and through the eyes of 3 spirits who visit him. Let's look at how this works. When we first meet Scrooge, he's the perfect embodiment of utilitarian free market capitalist philosophy that dominated the Victorian business culture. When 2 gentlemen come collecting for charity, Scrooge asks if there are no prisons or workhouses for the poor. When told that many would rather die than go to such places, he replies, "If they would rather die, then they had better do it and decrease the surplus population." This phrase, surplus population, comes directly from the political and economic debates of Dickens' time. Thomas Malthus had argued that population would always outstrip food supply, so poverty was inevitable, and helping the poor only made the problem worse. Many wealthy Victorians used this theory to justify their indifference to suffering. But Dickens shows us that this isn't just wrong economics, it's moral monstrosity. By putting these words in Scrooge's mouth and then showing us the real human beings affected by this philosophy, Dickens makes the inhumanity impossible to ignore. The Ghost of Christmas Present is particularly important for delivering Dickens' social message. When the ghost takes Scrooge to see the Cratchit family's Christmas celebration, we see poverty from the inside, not as a statistic or abstractions, but as real people struggling with dignity and love despite impossible circumstances. Bob Cratchit works for Scrooge for 15 shillings a week, barely enough to support his family. He can't afford proper medical care for Tiny Tim, who will die without it. Yet the family celebrates Christmas with genuine joy and gratitude, making the most of their meager resources. This scene does something psychologically brilliant. It makes Scrooge and the reader care about this family as individuals. Once you care about them, you can't dismiss their poverty as their own fault or tell yourself that helping them would only encourage dependency. When Scrooge asks if Tiny Tim will live, the ghost throws Scrooge's own words back at him. If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Hearing his callous philosophy applied to a specific child he's come to care about forces Scrooge to recognize its cruelty. But the most powerful social commentary comes when the Ghost of Christmas Present reveals 2 wretched children hiding under his robes, ignorance and want. These allegorical figures represent the twin evils of poverty, lack of education and lack of basic necessities. Oftentimes, ignorance and want are left out of adaptations of A Christmas Carol, but I think they're important to address. The spirit warns Scrooge to beware them both, but most of all beware the boy, ignorance. For on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased. This is Dickens' warning to Victorian society. If you don't educate and care for poor children, they will grow up to destroy our civilization. When Scrooge asks if these children have no refuge, the spirit again throws his words back. Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses? The prisons and the workhouses that Scrooge thought were adequate solutions are revealed as part of the problem, not the solution. This is Dickens' fundamental argument. Treating poverty as a moral failing that can be punished away doesn't work. It only creates more suffering and social instability. The only real solution is compassion backed by concrete help, better wages, better working conditions, education for children, and genuine care for the vulnerable. But Dickens doesn't just criticize. He offers a vision of what the alternative looks like. Scrooge's transformation isn't just about becoming more generous with money. It's about recognizing his fundamental connection to other human beings. When Scrooge wakes on Christmas morning and decides to change, he doesn't just send a turkey to the Cratchits and think his duty is done. He raises Bob's salary, ensures Tiny Tim gets medical care, and becomes a second father to the boy. He transforms from someone who sees employees as costs to being minimized into someone who recognizes his responsibility for their well-being. The novella's ending, where we're told that Scrooge knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge, isn't just about holiday cheer. It's about maintaining year-round the spirit of generosity, compassion, and social responsibility that Christmas represents. Dickens is arguing that this transformation isn't just good for the recipients of charity, it's good for the giver. Scrooge is happier, more connected, more fully human after his transformation. The miserly isolation that made him wealthy also made him miserable. True prosperity, Dickens suggests, comes from connection and compassion, not from hoarding wealth. This is a revolutionary message in a capitalist society that measures success purely in financial terms. Dickens is saying that a society organized around individual profit maximization and indifference to others' suffering is fundamentally sick, and that healing it requires recognizing our interdependence and mutual responsibility. Let's talk about Victorian Christmas traditions. Here's something that might surprise you. The Christmas we celebrate today, with its emphasis on family gatherings, gift-giving, festive meals, and charitable giving, was largely invented by the Victorians, and A Christmas Carol played a crucial role in creating and popularizing these traditions. In the early 1800s, Christmas was a relatively minor holiday in England. Yes, people had the day off work, and there were some religious observances, but it wasn't the major celebration it would become. The Puritan influence of previous centuries had discouraged elaborate Christmas festivities as too Catholic or too pagan. But this was changing during Dickens' lifetime. The Industrial Revolution had created a new middle class with money to spend and anxiety about how to spend it appropriately. They were looking for ways to distinguish themselves from the working classes below them and to create family traditions that would give meaning to their newly prosperous lives. At the same time, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's German husband, was introducing German Christmas traditions to the British court. The Christmas tree, which Albert brought from Germany, became fashionable among the upper and middle classes. Christmas cards, introduced in 1843, the same year as A Christmas Carol, became a popular way to maintain social connections. But it was Dickens who gave all these emerging traditions meaning and emotional resonance. A Christmas Carol essentially told the Victorian middle class what Christmas should be about and why it mattered. Look at how Dickens describes the Cratchit family's Christmas dinner. They're poor, they can't afford a large goose, much less a turkey, but they make their modest meal into a feast through their love and their togetherness. Mrs. Cratchit serves the pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in half of a quartern of ignited brandy. This description does something important. It makes poverty respectable and even admirable when combined with family love and proper values. The Cratchits may not have had much, but they know how to celebrate Christmas properly, with gratitude, togetherness, and joy. For middle-class readers, this provided a template for their own celebrations. Christmas should be about family, about creating warm domestic scenes, about expressing love through carefully chosen gifts and shared meals. It wasn't just about religious observance or about having the day off work. It was about creating and reinforcing family bonds. Dickens also helped establish charitable giving as a central Christmas tradition. The scene where the two gentlemen come collecting for the poor would have been very familiar to Victorian readers. Christmas was becoming associated with annual charitable appeals. But Scrooge's initial refusal and eventual curiosity taught readers how they should respond to such appeals. The character of Scrooge himself became a cultural touchstone. To be called a Scrooge meant you were violating the Christmas spirit by being uncharitable. The story created social pressure to be generous, at least at Christmas, because no one wanted to be identified with the pre-transformation Scrooge. The novella also emphasized Christmas as a time for family reconciliation. Scrooge's isolation is shown as unnatural and unhealthy. His nephew Fred's invitation to Christmas dinner, which Scrooge initially refuses, represents the pull of family connection that Scrooge has been resisting. When Scrooge finally accepts Fred's invitation after his transformation, it's portrayed as a crucial part of his redemption. He's rejoining human society, reconnecting with family, choosing relationship over isolation. This helped establish the Victorian and modern idea that Christmas is primarily a family holiday, when people should set aside differences and come together. Dickens even influenced what we eat at Christmas. His descriptions of roasted goose, Christmas pudding, wassail, and festive treats help standardize the Victorian Christmas menu. When Scrooge sends the Cratchits a prize turkey, he's not just being generous, he's establishing turkey as the ultimate Christmas luxury. The idea of Christmas as a magical time, especially for children, also gets reinforced throughout the story. Tiny Tim's "God bless us, everyone" became one of the most quoted lines in English literature, encapsulating the innocent joy that Christmas should bring to children. But perhaps most importantly, A Christmas Carol helped establish the idea that Christmas has the power to transform people. The ghost story framework, where the supernatural intervention reveals moral truths, suggests that Christmas itself has a kind of spiritual power that can break through even the hardest hearts. This idea that Christmas should be a time of spiritual renewal, moral reflection, and personal transformation became central to Victorian and modern Christmas celebrations. It's why we have New Year's resolutions shortly after Christmas, why people talk about the Christmas spirit, and why so many Christmas stories follow the pattern of a cynical or troubled person being transformed by the holiday. Dickens essentially created a secular Christmas theology, a set of beliefs about what Christmas means and how it should be celebrated, that doesn't require a specific religious doctrine, but does require certain moral commitments to generosity, family, and compassion. Let's talk about the theme of capitalism versus compassion. At its heart, A Christmas Carol is about a conflict between two ways of understanding human value and social organization. Scrooge represents pure capitalism, the belief that individual profit-seeking is the highest good and that market mechanisms should determine all social relations. The transformed Scrooge represents a vision of compassionate capitalism, where market activity is tempered by moral responsibility and social obligation. Let's look closely at how Dickens sets up this conflict. Scrooge isn't just wealthy, he's actively devoted to accumulating more wealth at the expense of everything and everyone else. He pays his clerk as little as possible, keeps his office cold to save on coal, refuses every social invitation because they cost money or time that could be spent on business. But Dickens shows that this single-minded focus on profit hasn't made Scrooge happy. He's isolated, unloved, and spiritually dead. His money hasn't brought him joy or meaning. It's just a number that keeps growing while his life keeps shrinking. This is Dickens' first argument against pure capitalism. It doesn't even work in its own terms. If the goal is happiness and flourishing, then Scrooge's approach is a complete failure. He sacrificed everything that makes life worth living in pursuit of wealth that brings him no satisfaction. The Ghost of Christmas Past shows us how Scrooge became this way. We see him as a lonely schoolboy, neglected by his father. Then we see him as a young man, apprenticed to the generous Mr. Fezziwig, who throws a wonderful Christmas party for his employees. Scrooge is joyful at this party, dancing and celebrating with the others. This Fezziwig scene is crucial because it shows an alternative model of capitalism. Fezziwig is a businessman, but he treats his employees like family. He spends money on their happiness and well-being because he recognizes that profit isn't the only measure of business success. The happiness and loyalty he creates are valuable. Young Scrooge says that Fezziwig has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. This is Dickens' argument that employers have enormous power over their workers' lives and therefore enormous responsibility for their well-being. But then we see Scrooge being seduced away from this model by the pursuit of wealth. His fiancée, Belle, breaks their engagement because she sees that Scrooge has changed, that his love of money has displaced his love of her. She tells him, "You fear the world too much. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach." This is a sophisticated psychological insight. Scrooge isn't pursuing wealth out of greed or materialism, he's pursuing it out of fear. Having experienced poverty and neglect as a child, he's determined to accumulate enough money that he can never be vulnerable again. But in protecting himself from material vulnerability, he's made himself emotionally and spiritually impoverished. The Ghost of Christmas Present shows the consequences of Scrooge's philosophy on other people. The Cratchit family struggles because Scrooge pays Bob the minimum he can get away with. Tiny Tim will die because Bob can't afford medical care. Scrooge's profit is literally built on Bob's poverty and Tim's suffering. But Dickens doesn't just make this story about heartless rich people and virtuous poor people. He shows how Scrooge's philosophy affects everyone in society, including other business people. When the ghost shows Scrooge the merchant on the exchange, they're discussing someone who has died, Scrooge himself, in the future the ghost is showing him. The merchants are joking about the deceased man's miserliness, but no one seems genuinely affected by his death. One says he'll go to the funeral if lunch is provided. This scene reveals something important. In a purely transactional society where relationships are based only on economic exchange, no one really cares about anyone else. Scrooge has conducted his business relationships on purely financial terms, so when he dies, people respond to his death in purely financial terms. His life has had no meaning beyond the money he accumulated. The most horrifying moment comes when the ghost of Christmas yet to come shows Scrooge the thieves dividing up his possessions. They've stolen the curtains from around his deathbed, the shirt from his corpse, and even his bedclothes, selling everything they can get their hands on, because Scrooge, having lived purely by market principles, is now subject to those same principles even in death. Mrs. Dilber, one of the thieves, defends her actions. If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, a wicked old screw, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime? If he had been, he'd have had somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there, alone, by himself. This is Dickens' devastating point. If you treat everything as a transaction, eventually you'll be treated the same way. Scrooge lived by pure capitalism, and pure capitalism has no place for compassion, loyalty, or human dignity, even toward the dead. But then Dickens shows us the alternative. The transformed Scrooge doesn't abandon capitalism. He doesn't give away all his money or stop being a businessman. Instead, he reforms capitalism with compassion. He raises Bob's salary, not out of charity, but because he recognizes that paying a living wage is part of his responsibility as an employer. He becomes involved in Tiny Tim's care, not as a distant philanthropist, but as someone personally invested in the boy's well-being. He reconnects with his nephew Fred and accepts that family relationships matter more than money. He becomes generous with the charitable donations, recognizing that individual prosperity creates obligations to help those less fortunate. This is Dickens' vision of how capitalism should work. Market activity and profit-seeking are fine, even necessary, but they must be balanced by moral responsibility, social obligation, and genuine human connection. Business success should create happiness for everyone involved, not just wealth for the owner. The final image of the transformed Scrooge is crucial. He became as good a friend, as good a master, and as good a man as the good old city knew. Friend, master, man, all three roles are equally important. Scrooge hasn't stopped being a master, employer, but he's learned to be a good one who recognizes his obligations to those who depend on him. This is ultimately an argument for moral capitalism, for a form of market economy that operates within ethical constraints and recognizes that human well-being is the ultimate goal, not just the means to profit. It's not socialism or communism. Dickens isn't arguing against private property or business ownership, but it's also not the pure free market capitalism that dominated Victorian economic thinking. Instead, it's a vision of an economy guided by moral principles where success is measured not just in profit, but in the happiness and flourishing of everyone involved, where employers recognize their responsibility to workers, where the wealthy accept obligations to help the poor, and where community and compassion are valued as highly as individual achievement. Let's talk about the enduring impact of A Christmas Carol. The immediate impact of A Christmas Carol was extraordinary. It was published on December 19, 1843, and sold out its first printing of 6,000 copies by Christmas Eve, just a few days later. By the end of the holiday season, it had gone through multiple printings and become a phenomenon. But the commercial success was just the beginning. The novella fundamentally changed how people thought about Christmas, charity, and social responsibility. Within a few years, Christmas Carol and Scrooge had entered the language as cultural references that everyone understood. Employers who refused Christmas bonuses or holiday time off were called Scrooges. The phrase "bah humbug" became shorthand for cynical dismissal of sentiment. "God bless us, every one" became a way to express the Christmas spirit of universal goodwill. The story influenced social policy in concrete ways. The publicity around the novella, combined with Dickens' other Christmas stories, contributed to growing pressure for factory reforms, education for the poor, and better treatment of workers. It didn't single-handedly create these reforms, but it changed the emotional and moral climate in ways that made reform politically possible. The novella also influenced how other writers approached social issues. It proved that you could combine entertainment with social criticism, that moral instruction could be delivered through compelling storytelling, and that reaching popular audiences was just as important as impressing literary critics. Writers as diverse as George Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell, and later social realists all learned from Dickens' technique of using individual stories to eliminate broader social problems. The tradition of a socially engaged popular fiction that continues today can be traced directly back to A Christmas Carol's success. The story structure, a fantastical journey that leads to moral transformation, has been endlessly adapted and imitated. Every Christmas movie where a cynical person learns to embrace the holiday spirit, every story about a miser who becomes generous, every tale of personal redemption through supernatural intervention owes something to A Christmas Carol. But perhaps most importantly, the novella established a moral framework for thinking about wealth and poverty that continues to influence us today. The idea that prosperity creates obligations, that we're all connected and responsible for each other, that individual transformation can create social change. These concepts have become central to how we think about social responsibility. Let's talk about the modern relevance of A Christmas Carol. What makes A Christmas Carol continue to resonate more than 180 years after it was written? Why do we keep adapting, retelling, and reimagining the story in every medium imaginable? Because of the fundamental tension it explores between individual profit-seeking and social responsibility, between treating people as economic units and recognizing their full humanity, remains unresolved in our contemporary world. We're still arguing about living wages, about employers' responsibilities to workers, about the role of charity versus systemic change in addressing poverty. The debates Dickens engaged with in 1843 sound remarkably similar to contemporary discussions about income inequality, corporate social responsibility, and the social safety net. Scrooge's philosophy that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, that helping the poor only encourages dependency, that his only obligation is to maximize his own profit, is alive and well in modern economic and political discourse. Every time someone argues against raising the minimum wage or expanding social programs because it might reduce business profits, they're channeling Scrooge. But Dickens' counter-argument also resonates, that this philosophy is not only morally wrong, but practically short-sighted. That treating workers badly creates social instability, that extreme inequality threatens everyone's prosperity, and that a society organized purely around individual profit-seeking makes everyone miserable, even the wealthy. The novella's message about transformation and redemption also feels particularly relevant in our time. Dickens suggests that people can change, that it's never too late to recognize mistakes and choose a better path, that individual moral choices matter even in the face of large systemic problems. This is neither naive optimism nor cynical despair. It's a realistic assessment that social change requires both individual transformation and systemic reform, that personal generosity and structural justice are both necessary, and that we have both the power and the responsibility to create a more compassionate society. The Christmas Carol framing, using a holiday story to deliver social commentary, also remains effective. By wrapping this social criticism in the festive emotional package of Christmas, Dickens reaches people's hearts before engaging their minds. The story makes us feel the rightness of compassion before we can construct rational defenses of selfishness. If today's exploration of A Christmas Carol has inspired you to delve deeper into this influential novella and its context, I've got some wonderful recommendations for you. For understanding the story's creation, Les Standiford's The Man Who Invented Christmas tells the story of how Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol in just 6 weeks while facing financial pressure and personal crisis. It's a fascinating look at creativity under pressure. For historical context, J.A.R. Pimlott's The Englishman's Christmas, A Social History, traces how Christmas celebrations evolved and how Dickens influenced those changes. Judith Flanders' Christmas, A Biography, includes excellent chapters on how Dickens and other Victorians invented modern Christmas traditions. For Victorian social issues, Gertrude Himmelfarb's The Idea of Poverty explores Victorian debates about poverty and charity that provide crucial context for understanding the novella's social message. For literary analysis, Paul Davis's The Lives and Times of Ebenezer Scrooge is a cultural history showing how the story and the character have been interpreted and adapted over time. For experiencing Dickens' Christmas, if you want to experience a Victorian Christmas firsthand, Penn Vogler's Scoff, A History of Food and Class in Britain includes recipes and descriptions of Victorian Christmas meals, including the dishes Dickens describes. Thank you so much for joining me on this deeper exploration of A Christmas Carol. I hope I've convinced you that this beloved story is so much more than holiday entertainment. It's a sophisticated piece of social criticism that helped reshape how we think about wealth, poverty, and our obligations to one another. Next week, we've got something a little bit different, and I'll keep that a surprise. But until then, keep reading and stay curious. And if you've been moved by the London that Dickens brought to life, the fog, the Christmas markets, the bustling streets, remember that you can walk those same streets and visit the places that inspired his imagination. You can find out more about experiencing Dickens' world firsthand at thebookclubtour.com. Well, my tea's getting cold, so until next time, keep reading and stay curious.